Well, it's almost Christmas time here in Lake Tahoe, and I've got to get busy and make some family gifts, gifts for a few close friends. I don't have much time. I'm going to make a run of paperweights. These are a fairly simple project, but a lot of work to set up to just do one. So I'm going to do a multiple of about a dozen of these. They'll be stave constructed blocks of wood that I'll turn on the lathe. I'll include some inlaid pieces using a router bit just to decorate up this assembly of wood. It's kind of a fun project. You never quite know what you're going to get once you deal with those, laminated layers. But follow along as I make this series of paperweights. What I've done here first, I've taken and gone through my wood pile, and I've grabbed an assortment of wood, and I've milled all this down to a consistent thickness, about 1.5 inches. So I've got some pieces of mesquite. All these pieces are the same thickness, and I put a straight edge on one side of all these pieces. I've got some tulip wood, some maple, some ebony, got a little bit of rosewood here. And like I say, I've milled everything to a consistent thickness. The exact thickness doesn't matter. These happen to be about 1.5 inches thick with one straight edge on each piece. That's so I can use my fence and cut a 22.5-degree bevel along one edge and then create simple staves out of this material. I've got to set up my table saw to cut those first bevels next.
Each of my paperweights will require 8 staves, coming pretty close to a point in the middle. I can make the first cut on a table saw in a conventional manner, but the second cut I'm going to actually have to do upside down so the material is supported. The big end will be facing my table saw table. Like I said, the first cut's not too difficult. That's just a standard rip cut with my blade at a 22.5-degree angle. I can make one cut on one side of all my boards. That first cut was the easy part. The second cut needs a sled. I've used the same 22.5-degree setting, and I've ripped a couple of boards and glued them together. Where my finger's rubbing there, that'll go against the fence. Here on this platform is where my material will sit. I'll devise a little clamp to hold this in place so that I can cut on the other side of my blade and put the other 22.5-degree bevel on this piece of wood, coming to a point at the top. To hold my material down, I'm going to use another board of MDF that's been drilled to accommodate some small lag bolts. This will very securely hold my material onto this sled, so I can then go to my table saw on the other side of the blade. Using a heavy sled like this, and by pushing through that blade in a very smooth motion, I can create a very smooth surface on the sides of my boards. So here are my pieces. They've all got nice, perfect 22.5-degree bevel cuts along each edge. I'll take those to the chop saw, cut them into short lengths, about 2.5 to 3 inches long. And I've also cut quite a variety of veneers that are going to go in between all these short little staves. Here I'm perfecting the surfaces, getting rid of any evidence of a saw blade. Now this is a lot of surfaces to glue together, so I'm going to do it step at a time as opposed to a one-step glue job. It's just too many surfaces. By doing this one step at a time, I can just do a better job of applying glue to all the surfaces and applying plenty of pressure to drive all that excess glue out. I want nice tight seams, and that's a lot of surfaces to clamp at one time. This just works better this way. The next step is just to put the quarters into half sections. Same kind of gluing process, except for clamps I'm going to just use a lot of rubber bands. I'll take these small ones and double them up and put a lot of them on there. That'll give me enough pressure against that seam. Now I can clean up these halves and get perfect matching surfaces by putting pencil marks across this face and then just briefly touching the sanding disc. When the pencil marks quickly disappear, then I know I've got a perfect flat surface. The last glue job is pretty simple, spreading the glue, and a couple of small hose clamps provide plenty of pressure here. After this is set for a while, it's a simple matter of removing the clamps, go back to the disc sander, clean these surfaces up. To get them ready to go on the lathe, I'm going to drill holes in the center. To get my holes centered, I've used this countersink first. That countersink depression really allows me to get that drill bit centered. Instead of using a conventional screw chuck, I've got a piece of all thread being held with my chuck jaws. I need to be able to mount these in a router jig a little bit later. At this point of the game, I'm just truing things up, making it round and flat, getting it ready for the next step. After flattening this end, I'm going to take it off this piece of threaded bolt and put it back on. That first side that I flattened, or first end, that'll become the bottom of my paperweights. Here I'm going to put a taper on, just a rough angle, about 15 to 20 degrees or so. This is going to match the router jig that I've built. Here's the jig, 3/4 inch MDF screwed together. It's got a top surface of melamine, and this surface here where the blanks get mounted, that's angled, so the side of the blank is more or less horizontal. It's tightened with a bolt that runs all the way through. There's pencil marks here that align the center of each stave so that the routed groove will be centered between the veneers. The rails here have a little dust trap so the router runs smooth. And I'll make one pass after another, going a little bit deeper each time until I can get to the proper depth that I'm looking for. After repeating that process 8 times, I'll get these V notches. They're 90-degree V notches. I've done that to all 15 of these blanks. The 90-degree notch will accept square material such as this. Before cutting that material into little short pieces, I'm going to glue on 2 pieces of veneer on 2 adjoining edges. This is a multi-step process, 1 piece of veneer at a time onto each piece. Here I'm going to just clamp 2 strips at the same time with a spacer in between. Once this is cured, I can take it apart, clean up an edge, run that edge next across a joiner blade, and then go to my table saw and cut a strip, if you will. So now I have all these different strips with a piece of veneer on one surface. I'm going to run them through the drum sander, prepare the adjoining surface for another piece of veneer. I'll protect my first piece with some blue tape before gluing on another piece to the surface just around the corner from the first one. This process gets repeated until I've got 2 different colored pieces of veneer on 2 adjoining surfaces on this stick of wood. The process, like I say, gets repeated over and over. I'm being careful, trying to keep nice square corners on this assembly.
Well, about now you've probably figured out that this is more a woodworking project than a wood turning project. And a big part of the woodworking is the preparation of these little square pieces of wood. Each one of these has 4 pieces of veneer put on one at a time. The gluing is pretty easy, but the preparation of that surface for the next veneer layer takes some time. I've experimented around with different techniques, and when it comes right down to it, a simple utility blade knife, trimming down close to the surface that I want in a conventional cut, but not taking it right to the surface. The last removal, I do a scraping. I do a scraping with the blade almost perpendicular, and that avoids tearing out beyond the edge that I want to maintain. It's difficult to predict exactly how this veneer might tear. Sometimes you can't really tell which way the grain direction's going, but if you remove that last smidgen with a scraping cut, you get a nice crisp square edge, which is really what you have to have.
Here I'm just checking the fit. I want a nice snug fit. Hopefully I've kept my assemblies square so they'll go into those square notches. And here I've chopped them into short lengths to go into my paperweights. To ensure that I have real tight glue joints, instead of just throwing some rubber bands around all 8 of those at one time, I'm going to glue these together in pairs. I've put that little spacer on there so that this type of clamp, this quick clamp, will not push the little sticks down the tapered sides. Without that spacer, they just wouldn't stay in place. So a quick clamp at one end and a lot of rubber bands at the other end ensures plenty of pressure as I assemble these. Here's the last pairs that were glued on all 15 paperweights. My next step is to prepare plugs. These will be inserted in the tops of the paperweights at the intersection of all the staves. So by just tapering this stick of wood and parting off plugs, I'll get a number of different plugs out of each stick of wood. I'll do this to several different species of wood in assorted sizes. Now I can start to turn my paperweights. First step, obviously, is to get rid of all that excess wood that's sticking out. Just going to rough this shape and prepare this end for the plugs. Put a tapered opening in there, do a series of test fits until I get a good fit, some glue, and just tap this into place. Now I've got all my paperweights assembled except for the bottom. It's finally time to put a finished shape on these. So back on my piece of all thread, and I'll just shape some nice curves, do some shear scraping on it, and then sand it down to 400, maybe 600 grit. For my final finish, I'll put several coats of sanding sealer. I'll buff it in between coats with a sanding mop, and I'll apply finish coats in the same way, buffing in between coats. I didn't show it, but back when I first mounted the blanks on the screw chuck, I turned these shallow recesses. I did it at that point because I knew at this point of the game it would be difficult to mount these accurately in order to turn it. These will accept plugs to finish off the bottoms. Just as I created the plugs for the top, I'm doing the same thing for the bottom. These just happen to be a little bit larger. It just takes a little bit of glue and a tap with a hammer, and now the bottom side is done.
Well, these paperweights have been a lot of work, and they're not done yet. I still need to put several coats of finish on the top side, and there's the bottom side that needs to be finished off. Now, the simplest way to do this bottom would be to just put it up against a disc sander and then hit it with a palm sander to put a nice smooth bottom on it. But, these are going to be picked up and handled by people, so I'm going to take the trouble to reverse chuck this, reverse mount it, so I can turn this bottom. I'll get a little nicer, more interesting finish that way. To do that, and it's an awkward shape, like I say, it's going to take a little tricky jam chuck. I've got some MDF scraps here, and I'm just going to glue these together, and then I'll turn a holding device, if you will. So let me glue these together, and then we'll get it on the lathe and try to fit one of these up to turn the bottom side.
A little tight bond and some spring clamps puts this thing together. You'll notice the middle layer has a little gap in it. That's just in case I need access in order to pry a piece out of the jam chuck. Okay, now I've got this opening roughed out, and I'm creating a little recessed area for the top portion of the paperweights. Here I'm measuring all the diameters, putting them in order from smallest to largest. By fitting up the smallest one first and working my way to the largest, I should be able to use the same jig for all 15. During the initial turning, I can use my tailstock, at least for a little while, and once this is turned and sanded, to remove it, I'll just use a steel knockout rod with a little piece of wood attached.
Well, I'm almost to the end of this project, but there's still a lot of finish work to do. I want to make sure this wood is well sealed because it's thick wood, and as we know, moisture affects the dimensions of wood. The bigger the piece of wood, the more dimensional change, and therefore the more potential for some stress in these glue joints. By having a really good finish on there, I can at least reduce that moisture effect somewhat. These have had several coats of sanding sealer, and now I'm going to put probably at least 4, maybe 5 coats of a spray lacquer, just this rattle can stuff. This happens to be Def, but I could have used any brand. But you know, it's up to you. You can put wipe on poly, you can put an oil finish, whatever you'd like. But make sure you seal these well.
So there you have it. Now it's just a matter of putting some spray finish on here, buffing it with that sanding mop. The sanding mop's about 320, sometimes 400 grit. And then as a last step, I'm buffing it with some buffing compound. These are fun to do. They're a lot more efficient to do in batches, though. To do just one would be a lot of work compared to doing 15.